everyone on those back benches. I think there are plenty of seats out here, right? And Klaus, do you want to send an email to folks in RG to come join the session, right? So colleagues, good morning. I'm very happy to welcome all of you to this research track session on policies to improve housing affordability. What's more interesting when I read the papers, all these papers talk about misallocation in land and housing markets. And Klaus, I'm really glad we're doing a research track. And all of you who have joined, and I know they're competing sessions, I'm sure you'll get a lot of valuable information, right? So my name is Zhou. I'm an economic advisor in the Chief Economist's Office of the World Bank. And I'm very excited to introduce our four speakers. So the first paper is Under the Hood, Understanding Interactions Among Zoning Regulations. Amrita Kulka is a assistant professor at the Department of Economics at the University of Warwick, and she used to be a postdoc at NYU's Furman Center. And then as the speakers, as we have the different presenters, I'll introduce the others. Amrita, you got about 20 minutes, and if anyone has a burning question while she's speaking, raise your hands and come in. Otherwise, let's give her the full 20 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes, if it's okay, Klaus, to have Q&A, and then we move to the next paper. All right, Amrita, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Shomik. So yeah, I'm Amrita. I'm very, very happy to be here today to present joint work with my co-authors, Aradhya Sood and Nick Chiumenti. The current title of the paper is Under the Neighborhood, Understanding Interactions Among Zoning Regulations. We've been through a few titles, so we hope this one sticks. So, that's basically all I'd say. The other thing I'll say is this this paper uses data from Boston, but we hope that the point we make has a broader applicability as well, not just to the US and not just to Boston, certainly. So I don't need to necessarily motivate this paper to a session on housing affordability, but we all know that housing is becoming increasingly unaffordable in cities around the world. So this is a problem really everywhere. For our location, we're going to look at Greater Boston. You can measure this. We know that housing is not just becoming more expensive, but it's becoming more expensive relative to income. So affordability is going down. And the supply of new housing has certainly not kept up with this increase in prices. At the same time, there's very little vacant space in the Greater Boston area, so only about 1.9% of lots are undeveloped. And so the first idea of just sort of building new housing on vacant land is also not going to work, and any way of addressing housing affordability here is going to require thinking about areas that are already built up. So there could be many reasons for the housing affordability crisis, but one that has come under increased scrutiny in the last few years is basically zoning or land use regulations. And so in the United States, over the course of the 20th century, local governments have adopted many, many types of land use regulations. And these are currently really in the eye of policymakers as needing some reform. So we did kind of a quick search at some point last year, and we found that at least 54 municipal, state, and national governments relaxed one or more regulations recently, and this is worldwide. And this was really just scratching the surface, and so it's a huge area of reform at the moment. But to some extent, it's unclear how effective these reforms are going to be. And of course, the reason to reform land use in particular is because it restricts the supply of new housing, and so therefore might drive or increase housing inaffordability. So it's unclear how effective these reforms are going to be, and that's for a few reasons. So the literature has studied regulations in one of mostly two different ways. And so Jonah is going to be telling us about one specific regulation in a little bit. I've done work myself on one regulation in particular. And so a lot of the literature has looked at individual regulations and their impact, which is an extremely important thing to do, but it misses sometimes the fact that regulations operate in a broader context and interact with other kinds of regulations as well. The second way of studying regulations has been through kind of an index or wedge approach. And this does take into account that there are multiple regulations, But it's very difficult to say based on an index what is the regulation that we should be changing in order to change affordability or in order to increase supply. So that's really where this paper comes in. We're going to study the interaction among different kinds of zoning regulations, looking at the three most popular ones that exist. So that's going to be density regulation, so how many dwelling units are allowed on 1 acre of land, say. It's going to be things like height restrictions, which are probably familiar to all of you. And then also, maybe a bit more specific to the US, whether or not apartment buildings are allowed in an area at all. I want to make one thing also very clear. There are many ways of studying zoning regulations. Some of them take into account the fact that you can study them in general equilibrium, so taking supply seriously, taking demand seriously, and including regulations into a big general equilibrium model. Again, we'll see examples of those later today. We're going to be focusing very narrowly under the neighborhood. So we're looking at very local variation in these regulations and seeing what we can learn from this local variation. So we'll develop an empirical framework that uses a boundary discontinuity design to study basically the impact of regulation at these very local boundaries. A lot of the literature has focused on boundaries that are also administrative boundaries, such as city boundaries. So what we'll be doing is instead we're looking at variation in the regulation within cities, within school attendance areas. So worries that you might have that households are sorting for other reasons at these boundaries should be taken care of to a large extent here. We built a small theoretical framework that we're also in the course of reworking right now to focus and sort of make clear what the local impacts of the regulation are. And in addition to sort of the option value effect and supply effect, which have been studied in the literature a bit more, we also really highlight what we call the composition effect, so the fact that regulation changes what type of building gets built. And I won't have time to go over this today, but in the paper we also do a small policy simulation based on a recent Boston policy to increase density near transit stops. Okay, so this is a very full slide, but what do we find very quickly? So we find that in the Boston area, there's one regulation that really stands out as being the most binding and as being the one that really needs to be relaxed in order to make any dent on housing supply and prices. That's going to be density. And so what we find is that basically at boundaries where combinations of regulations that involve density are relaxed or differ, that is where we see the largest increase in the number of units per lot. I think the bigger point that translates here is in a different city, it might not be density. It could be any other regulation. But the thing that's important to note is from a policy perspective, it needs to be identified what is really the most binding regulation in an area, because if that's not being relaxed, we're not really reaching very much. In terms of effects on prices, we find that at these same kind of boundaries where we see supply effects, we also see reductions in both rents and the sales prices of single-family homes. And so the rent declines are between 4% and 7%, sales prices between 2% and 4.5%. But these are the total jumps at the boundary. So this is the total effect of the regulation. Once you condition on the fact that regulations induce different kinds of constructions, different kind of house characteristics, most of these effects dissipate. So most of the regulation, the impact of the regulation is through changing the composition of the housing stock. And so that basically, you can think of that as changing kind of an entry fee into a neighborhood. It's changing what is the smallest available unit in an area. And by relaxing regulation, you make that smallest available unit smaller, and the cost of that is going to be cheaper. So for Chapter 40A, again, I'll refer you to the paper. So we look at the three most common regulations in the US. First of all, multifamily zoning, which is whether or not apartment buildings are at all allowed, maximum height restrictions, and then density regulations, which for us are going to be measured as dwelling units per acre, but this encompasses concepts such as the minimum lot size and the FAR, which you might be familiar with. So how did these regulations arise? In Boston, the first time height restrictions were introduced was in 1917, so early in the 20th century. And at that point, height restrictions were introduced in broad zoning categories as well. But relatively fast after that, after the Second World War, municipalities found that these regulations they had introduced didn't actually restrict density enough relative to what they wanted. And so density regulations were introduced. So my point here is that over a period of time, up until the first zoning code was established, a bunch of regulations were introduced and basically overlaid on top of each other. And so the interactions between these can be quite complex. So just to give you a very brief example, imagine there's a municipality that's 1 acre large, allows 5 dwelling units on an acre, no more than 20 feet of height, and doesn't allow apartments. Then at most, 5 single-family homes can be built in that municipality of 20 feet height each. Now, if you wanted to relax regulation there and you allowed apartment buildings, those 5 units, they could be restacked into an apartment, but that wouldn't actually help overall density in that area. And so that's really an example where maybe density is the binding regulation in this case. Okay, so our data comes from the greater Boston area. We look at 86 towns. We get data on zoning from the MAPC, on the universe of buildings from the Warren Group, and rent information from CoStar. This is what our variation basically looks like. So up here you see the towns in our sample and the 3 different regulations. And the boundaries that are shown here are town boundaries, but we're going to be using variation in the regulation within towns. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of variation here. And these 3 different regulations give us 6 different types of boundaries. So boundaries at which only one of the regulations differs, or boundaries where 2 of the regulations differ. So we have 6 different types of boundaries. They're listed down here. I just wanted to highlight one thing. If you look at the number of boundaries, the most common one for us is going to be the scenario number 3, where only density regulations differ on either side, but we have a decent amount of boundaries in most of the other categories as well. So the variation that we use is cross-sectional variation across space. So you should think of our effects as sort of long-run impacts of the regulation. Again, the same point you can see here as well. The blue boundaries, which is where only density changes, they show up the most. They're kind of spread out well across space. Some of the others are a bit more concentrated, such as these red boundaries that you see, which is where density and height change at the same time. And they're a bit more concentrated towards the central business district of Boston. Okay, so don't have much time to talk about theory, but just very quickly, what we are after is understanding the impact of combinations of regulations on prices and supply. But let's think for a second about how we expect the different regulations to impact the supply of units, so the number of units or number of units per lot. And of course, density in itself is directly targeted at the number of units per lot, so we would expect ex ante that any combination of regulations that involves density would actually have an impact on supply of units. On the other hand, height, for example, in and of itself, might not, right? Because height, holding constant density, holding constant whether or not apartments are allowed, is just changing the size of the buildings, but not how many units can be built. Similarly, for allowing apartments, that says something about the type of building. It says something about restacking units in a different way. So it could be that we see more units per lot, but we shouldn't see higher density at an area level. Now, this is interesting because if you look at the regulations that policymakers have decided to relax, so recently in the US, California, Oregon, Minneapolis, what they have mostly focused on is the first one, so allowing apartment buildings, but without often changing much about density. So you do kind of have this question, is this sort of a lack of understanding of the interaction of these regulations, or is it a first step towards a larger zoning reform? Okay, so in terms of prices, I will again say it's an equilibrium object, so ideally you do what Jonah does and is going to show us, is you're embedding the regulation into a model that takes into account supply and demand for units. What we're going to do is think of the supply effect as happening at a larger level. So the supply effect of adding more units should operate at kind of a city level. Whereas what we're going to study is basically the impact of the regulation right across the boundary. And so there we are going to focus on 3 main effects. The first one is the option value of regulation. Relaxed regulation means you can do more with that land. The second is the composition effect. I already mentioned regulation directly targets house characteristics. And the last one is, of course, households are sorting based on observed and unobserved characteristics of houses onto either side of the boundary. Okay, so we're going to do a spatial RD design. The assumptions required are basically that on either sides of the boundary, the type of housing and the density are changing because of the regulation. Close to the boundary, observed and unobserved quality should be continuous. Our specification is relatively simple, but allows us to capture non-parametrically both what's happening close to the boundary as well as further away. So we're going to regress outcomes on a set of distance bins to the boundary, boundary fixed effects, time fixed effects, and we're specifically initially not controlling for house characteristics. We do a bunch of work to make sure that we're focusing on boundaries where it's the regulation that matters and not something else. So we don't have time to go a lot into detail on this, but I already mentioned we take out boundaries that overlap with cities, that overlap with school attendance areas, obviously highways, rivers, and so on. We then go another step and say, okay, we're going to focus on straight line boundaries, so boundaries that are very likely not manipulated. And so that's the set of boundaries that we look at. What does that happen? What does that look like? We start with something like here on the left, all of it. The red lines on the left are city boundaries. We take those out first. We do several more steps, and we're left with the black boundaries on the right. So we're left with boundaries that are very clearly no longer related to administrative or economic boundaries. Okay, we also do a bunch of stuff to make sure that continuity assumptions hold. Don't have time to talk about it. Okay, so I'll show you a bunch of pictures that look like this. Everything that's going to be on the left of 0 is going to be the relatively more restrictive side on the boundary. Everything that's on the right is the relatively less restrictive side of the boundary. So more restrictive being lower density, less restrictive being higher density. So first we're going to look at the number of units per lot, so the supply effect essentially. And we're going to look at the different boundary types. So what we find here is that at boundaries where only density changes, there's an increase in the number of units per lot here by about 9%. Similarly, when density and height change at the same boundary, there's actually a doubling, about 109% increase in the number of units per lot, so a really big supply effect. We also see exactly this restacking of units as apartment buildings are allowed. We find that there's a 53% increase in the number of units per lot when apartment buildings are allowed, both sort of for density alone as well as when we change two regulations at the same time. We don't see, and this is not just for a lack of observations, our observations became smaller and smaller as we took out more and more boundaries, but we never saw an impact on the number of units per lot as height regulations change. And again, that checks out because height isn't really designed to affect density of units per lot. That's the number of units per lot, but what about the supply of house characteristics? You can look at that as well. And what we find here is very clearly at boundaries where density changes, either alone or with allowing apartment buildings, we see a lower number of bedrooms, a smaller lot size, smaller built area. So it's not just that there are more units on a lot, these units are also smaller in terms of their characteristics. I just want to highlight these don't have to be smaller, because on the relaxed side of the boundary, anything can be built. So they're smaller because that's what's being demanded. Okay, we don't really see much of a difference at boundaries when density and height change together. So we have, even though we have a lot more units on a lot, we don't actually see the characteristics of these units changing much. I'm probably already very out of time, so I'll need like 3 more minutes. Okay, fine.
I'll give it 3.
Yeah, thanks. So far, what we know is density seems to be what's really driving this in the Boston area. Again, doesn't have to be the case in a different city, but there's going to be probably some regulation or set of regulations that are the most binding. And characteristics are being affected as well. Now, for those boundaries where supply changes, what happens to prices? What we're going to find is that at boundaries where density changes, we see a reduction in prices, okay? Both in rents and sales prices of single-family homes, so about a 7% fall in rents and a 4.5% fall in prices. Similarly, when density and height relax together, we see sort of a smaller decline in rents, and when apartments are allowed and density relaxes, we see a small decline in the sales prices of single-family homes. Fine, so we have more units per lot. These units cost less. Now, the fact that we're looking at these really local areas allows us to control for house characteristics to understand how much of this is being driven basically by the composition of housing being different. So what we see here is in red and blue, the effects of before, and in gray, the effects once we control for house characteristics. So as you can see, once we control for the properties of the houses, basically this entire effect goes to 0 here. So most of the effect of the regulation is operating through providing different kinds of house characteristics, something very similar on this side. For rents, we see this less so. So remember that at boundaries where density and height both change, there isn't actually much difference in house characteristics. And that's reflected here, where there's not much difference once we control for these characteristics as well. So likely what's going on here is that households are actually sorting on unobserved characteristics to us of these properties. Okay, so where does that leave us? And I'm done in 30 seconds. It leaves us with the fact that you could say this is just a reduction in quality. So land use regulations are just reducing quality, and so it's cheaper. I think it's important to consider the total cost of housing. So again, these property characteristics didn't have to be smaller. They are smaller because that's what's being demanded. And so therefore, regulation seems to be creating overconsumption of housing to some extent, which is mitigated when you relax the regulation, and makes essentially the smallest unit in a neighborhood smaller and more affordable in terms of its total cost. Okay, I hope I convinced you that which regulation you're relaxing matters. A lot of this comes through house characteristics. Check our paper for the 40A stuff, and yeah, thanks. Happy to hear your questions.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Let's have 5 minutes of questions, and then we can have any clarifications. Please.
Thank you very much. Let me just start by saying I love your energy and fantastic study. So the question I have is, these regulations about what you can and cannot do, what form do they normally take? Is it government saying you can't do this, or government saying, well, if you do this, you pay more taxes, for example? And how are those regulations enforced?
Yeah, very good question. So it's different, and I think it differs across the world as well. So in the US, there's these zoning codes, which basically say what you can do by right. So there are regulations, there are certain things that you can construct by right. So you don't have to get a permit for it, or that permit should get approved automatically. And then there are regulations, they're kind of variances. There's variation in the regulation where you can apply for a permit, and that may or may not get accepted. So for example, regarding apartment buildings, in some areas, they're not by right allowed, but you can apply, and that permit could get accepted or it could get rejected. So that's how it works typically. In the UK, where I work, it's actually quite different. So over there, everything is basically based on a application basis. So you have to apply for anything that you want to build. And so I think this can vary quite a bit in the US, and a lot of people do love the system looking from outside. What's happening is there are some things that can be built by right, but a lot of the devil is a bit in the details on what applications get accepted and rejected. And in terms of your question on enforcement, so one thing you can look at is how many houses actually follow these regulations that they're supposed to follow. And it seems like they actually do for a very, very vast majority of cases, and the ones that don't are mostly older buildings that were grandfathered in and already existed at the time when the regulation was introduced. But I think your point is good that now there are a lot of programs thinking about incentives for affordable housing, for example, saying to developers, these are these tax incentives for developers, saying that if you set aside a certain amount of units, then that are affordable, we allow you to build an additional floor. So that's very common. There's a very nice paper on New York City about that. Happy to chat later. Sorry, very long answer.
Any other questions? All right, we'll take that. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Can you turn on the mic?
Yes, thank you. My name is Champaka. I was one among the core team leaders of the development plan for Greater Mumbai, and quite familiar with the discussions about, regulating density. Wonderful to look at your study and also to see the nature of findings. I had two questions, in fact. One is, what is the nature of inhabitants in the units within the regulation boundary that you're looking at? Is it, there must be a wide variety of inhabitants, including families and others who are more fleeting in terms of their occupancy of these units. The second was about, how do population growth dynamics interact with real estate growth dynamics and creation of demand for different typologies of dwelling units, because these are two very different kinds of dynamics. And often in the context of Mumbai, for instance, it's been almost impossible to regulate density. So these are questions. I'd love to hear your responses, please.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Again, really, really good points. So in terms of the occupants on either side of the boundary, we don't have a whole lot of information, but I think maybe where some of your questions are going towards, but correct me if I'm wrong, is also that these, making units smaller, for example, could mean that if I have a big family, I'm actually no longer able to live in these sort of, in a unit once it's been deregulated. I think that's often a fear. To that, in this particular context, what I would say is what we're seeing is sort of the equilibrium outcome in what gets built. And so if a lot here is about reducing very large floor space and sort of not even necessarily reducing the number of rooms, but essentially providing smaller areas, and that does seem to be demanded. So in terms of the mix of people, that seems to be something that's demanded. So that's what I could say to that. I think population growth is really important. So if you I have another paper studying minimum lot size regulations, and there what you see is over time, the bindingness of these regulations increases a lot. So over time, there's shifts in the spatial equilibrium, shifts in the demand for certain neighborhoods, and that increases the pressure on particular boundaries, especially. So I think that's a really important point. And it does put a lot of, it does say that, it does lead to us thinking that, for example, this policy that wants to relax density near transit stops is going to be especially powerful in suburban areas where these regulations are particularly binding, and with population growth, that can change a lot. So yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Happy to chat more also.
All
Yes,
right.
would love to.
We're going to go to the next paper, unless you have, why don't you ask a question, and then we can have that later in Q&A, right? So.
Okay, I can wait.
No, you can ask a question. Everyone knows the question.
I was just wondering whether, this is a great paper, by the way, is the kind of quality adjusted price effect that you find just size, or are there other like amenities, building amenities, age of the units, things like that also matter?
Yeah, so we think that especially you saw that in these, so the things that we can observe is mostly size, number of rooms, and so on, but it could definitely be, especially we think that at boundaries, sort of inner city Boston boundaries with high density, high height, that over there, a lot of it is probably unobserved quality in terms of amenities of the buildings, or in terms of, granite countertops, like classic examples. So those are just things we can't observe, but definitely play a role. Thanks.
Great. Let's move to the next paper, and thank you very much. Great presentation. The one takeaway I have is you may want to link these to school choice and school quality, because the way I see the US discourse, and maybe it's not applicable to Mumbai, is if local property taxes are financing your school districts, a lot of wealthier families are going to move out when densification happens. You see it in Washington right now, right? So great. Okay, now we got the second paper, Finding Home When Disaster Strikes, Dust Bowl Migration and Housing in Los Angeles. And we're very happy to have Gustavo Cortes presenting the paper. Gustavo is an assistant professor of finance at the University of Florida. He has a bachelor's in economics from University of São Paulo and a PhD in economics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Gustavo, I'm going to give you 20 minutes, and then we can open it up for questions and answers.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having us here. Really an honor to be at the World Bank for the first time. And this is a paper about climate-induced migration, right? And we're going to be focusing on LA for reasons that we'll discuss later. But this is joint work with Vinny Santana at MIT and Diogo Baerlocher at USF. So the main motivation for a paper like this, I guess, this is not the audience to motivate, but I think, in a general way, why do we want to study something like this, is that natural disasters already displace a lot of people every year, right? So if you look at the 2022 census household pulse survey, it's about 1.3% of the U.S. adult population. That's like a huge amount of people. And if you take just 2022 alone, pretty much, a couple of years ago, over 3 million people were displaced by natural disasters that year, right? And the worst part of it, the way I see it, is it's only going to get worse. If you look at the scientific evidence, scientific community says, this is even going to get even worse in the next decades. So, and migration is going to be even more of a response to try to lessen the negative effects that these populations will face, right? There are many papers that look at this, how migration helps to mitigate some of the losses that people face when they lose their, material wealth in their location. And as a result, this is just logic. Many people will be displaced by disasters, and they will have to seek refuge somewhere else. Some city will have to take, these migrants. So there is also a quote-unquote climate refugee name to describe that kind of population that will unfortunately be affected by that kind of disaster, right? So the main point of this paper is basically how does migration of climate refugees will impact housing market conditions in the cities that will receive them. And usually if you go to the literature, it's not that we're the first one to do this, but the arrival of migrants usually increases house prices and rents in the receiving regions, which makes sense, right? We're all familiar with the economics of supply and demand. So you have more people arriving in a city, more demand. Prices, house prices will respond to that. Rents will also respond to that. But there are all kinds of heterogeneous effects. You can think of many things that will also play a role in this equation, right? So there will also be the case in which, unfortunately, there will be some distaste for migrants, right? It has happened before in history that it caused some flight. Some of populations might see that migration as undesirable, and they basically want to avoid that by going somewhere else. And house prices may fall as a result of that, right? So the previous literature also has emphasized some other types of, distaste shocks. For example, there has been a few papers looking at ethnic and cultural differences and also racial differences. How do these characteristics of the migrants affect the price response? And we're doing this paper here is putting all the attention on the natural disaster-induced migration. And what will be unique about this paper, which is a little more, a bit different from what most of the papers in this literature have done, we're going to focus on a group that migrated that has, pretty, similar race, similar ethnicity. They were simply pushed to migrate for, some natural disaster that happened in this country in the 1930s. And they are, a group that obviously are economically vulnerable. But they are pretty much similar in that sense. It's not like, when you have international migration, the person might not speak the language of the country. They might not, they don't look like the population of the country they migrate to. This will be a case in which they are pretty similar, ethnically and racially, and they also speak the language. But we're going to also ask, how are they perceived by the locals when they arrive in the city? And it could also be the case that discrimination may arise even under those circumstances. So the contributions of our paper basically will be about the impacts of climate disaster-induced migration on housing. Has been already some papers looking at this. We're going to use like the Dust Bowl as a major shock. It's an important shock in the history of this country. And it will also allow us to isolate the effect from other factors that affect this decision to migrate. We know that migration decision is obviously very endogenous, depends on many things, but if a major disaster happens, it kind of leaves you with no choice. You got to migrate, and that from the point of view of an economist, is a desirable thing. So you can also isolate the effect of that decision. We're also contributing to there are two seminal papers by Rick Hornbeck at Chicago one most famous, most of you probably know, the American Economic Review paper that he looks at the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, and he looks at more aggregate outcomes. He never touched housing, which, understandable. He focused more on the local GDP and stuff. But, housing is an important component of wealth. So we think it's a very valid follow-up of that paper to look at, the effects on housing. And we're also using here the case of Los Angeles because, we're also able to geocode and link the addresses across the 1930s and 1940 censuses. So it's also a data-driven decision from our end, so we can observe more things. So if you're an American, the Americans here in the room will kind of revive memories from their history books, right? This is the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, one of the most severe natural disasters in all U.S. history. This is a result of combined weather conditions and also poor use of the land, right? So not a good use of cultural rotation, farming techniques. It basically led to prolonged drought. That created what people call these black blizzards, right? So this black blizzard is exactly what you see here. It basically destroyed the land, destroyed the capital as well. There are photos I'm not going to show here to the interest of time, but like showing the capital of the farmers completely destroyed by these blizzards. And historians estimate that close to 60% of the area population just left their homes. It was not possible to do anything. Where did they go? So these are the top 20 locations that people in the central United States affected by this disaster. They migrated mostly to California locations, right? So top of the list, Los Angeles County, but you can also see other places, Kern, California, King, San Diego, Alameda, Tulare, and everything. Like you can see, California played a big role here in the location where they decided to migrate to. And this is what, if you go to Library of Congress, this is what, they look like. Very important photograph. They were often called Okies. Also, these are derogatory terms, so just saying this for historical accuracy, but not, hillbillies. These are, they had stereotypes of poor, welfare-seeking, and unsuccessful migrants, right? There were many accounts of discrimination as well. We just don't have time to show all the newspaper writings, but there were many. So what kind of data we're going to use here to look at this episode? We're going to look at the historical census from 1930s and 1940s. This is the full count. We have the names of the people. We have the addresses of the people. So it's the restricted access version of the IPUMS USA. We're going to be mostly interested in house values, rents, and resident composition. We're also, this is the census, so it's a nice thing that you also have age, education, race, and a bunch of characteristics. We're also using the Urban Transition Historical GIS project by Logan and others. These will allow us to get all the addresses and the enumeration districts. And also something new that we do, Vinny and I have a paper that is mostly focusing on the Mexican immigration in the US. We use the linked addresses from that paper, 1930s and 1940, but in that paper, we actually do things for all the cities in the US. So we are not able to get address-specific, like house-specific addresses and geolocate them. Well, now here, the bright side of doing just one city, like Los Angeles, is that we're actually able to geocode the addresses from 1930s and 1940s, so we know exactly where each house is, right? So it's a new feature of this paper that we're doing over our earlier work. And we're also using, we're not going to reinvent the wheel. So Hornback, the AR paper, did such a good job at measuring which counties in the US got more affected by the Dust Bowl, drought. And so we're just borrowing, the county of residents of that individual in 1935. If you were in those regions that got destroyed by the Dust Bowl, we will treat you as, somebody affected by it. This will be mostly, counties in central states like Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and such. There are 3 levels of erosion at the county level. We experimented with, higher level of erosion, lower level. It doesn't change much. The results are pretty much robust to whatever choice you make. So remember, I mentioned you the beauty of you studying just one city, right? This is what we can do, right? If we use only Los Angeles, we're able to look every point that you see here, those purple dots. These are houses, right? Housing units, and we're able to define 1 kilometer grids, right? Because we're able to, geolocate every house. We're able to also aggregate them in a more granular way. So this would be, roughly 0.62 miles. Like these are, technically 30 arc seconds near the equator. And it also, one nice feature is that when you work with historical census data, things change from decade to decade. And so it's a mess to do things like, crosswalks. When you do things with grids, grids will be there forever, right? So it's a nice thing. They are consistent across censuses. It makes it easier for you to combine different decades. Now, this is how the Los Angeles looked like in 1930s. Just so you know, if you're not familiar with Los Angeles, these are the areas, more populated areas, number of households in 1930. And then in panel B here, we just take, all right, let's just focus on Dust Bowl migrants. Where were they in 1940? So they were pretty widespread, right? Of course, there are going to be more of them in the outskirts of the city, but it's a non-negligible amount of dust bowlers, as that's the term the newspapers used also. The dust bowlers also showed up in these more populated areas, which is in a sense good if you want to see the impact of their arrival. They're going to be pretty much in many parts of the city. Now, it's obviously it's not random. There are some characteristics that predict where they went. So if you look at the characteristics of the addresses that they went, these are the Dust Bowl migrants, and these are the other migrants, just so we can compare how they differ from the other migrants. They went disproportionately to houses with lower house value and lower rents, right? They were also in locations where with more domestic U.S.-born populations rather than more Mexicans or more foreigners, right? And that differs a little bit from what you see here in the other migrants. Now, of course, this could be just we're not naive here. This could be just a reason solely driven by the neighborhoods of their houses, right? You don't have money, you lost everything. The drought destroyed your farm, destroyed every piece of your wealth. Then you go to places that are already low rent, low value, because that's all you can afford. And that's true. Look at the neighborhood characteristics in 1930s, and you see here, low rent, low value, similar things, right? So it's not exactly related to the address. It has to do also with that broader, level of aggregation, and that we kind of expect. It's intuitive in our minds. But, the nice thing about having the house level granularity here is that we'll also be able to disentangle how much, each factor contributes to this disparity within neighborhood. So we're going to be able to, at some point, all right, I know they are in the poorer neighborhoods of LA, but within a poor neighborhood, that very fine grid, how were their houses different from every other's houses, right? Either migrants or U.S. born. We're going to be able to see that. So our empirical strategy, pretty standard. We're going to have a dummy variable here. If the head of household is a dust bowler, right? If they migrated from the dust bowl areas, we're going to be interested in the log difference of house value or the rent in address I in a neighborhood N. Remember, the neighborhood N is defined by the grid. And we're going to be controlling for the standard controls in this literature. If you read a paper on immigration in this, it uses census data. It's usually race, gender, U.S. born versus foreign born, high skilled, employed, and also some characteristics of the house, like number of residents in the household, value, rent in the earlier period, and most importantly, our neighborhood fixed effects. That will take care of a lot of variation that already explains why they migrated to those addresses. So this is the first set of results. So if you look here, panel A, the dependent variable here is the log of house values. What you see here is a bunch of negative coefficients, showing that the houses inhabited by the Dust Bowlers had a lower growth rate in home value and rents over the whole decade, right? So you also observe that in the rents of that period, right? Now, we know that immigrants are different in a sense. I mean, they were, they decided to move out of a city and arrive in another city. You're comparing people that were there already, so why don't you compare with other migrants, right? So more comparable, the results, right? So we're also, again, controlling for neighborhood. So within a certain neighborhood that is already, let's say, a lower income neighborhood where houses cost less, we're comparing those Dust Bowl migrants with other migrants. And now the house value effects disappear, probably because we're pretty much wiping out 95% of our sample when we do it. But the house rents, actually, a quarter of the sample remains. It's still pretty significant, the effect, right? So house values lose power, but the rent results remain significant, even for that very narrow comparison of Dust Bowlers versus other migrants within a neighborhood. And now here comes, I think, this is in my view, the most striking result, right? So remember what I told you. This literature has shown racial discrimination, ethnic discrimination. Now, the Dust Bowl migrants, they were all the same ethnicity, same race, they spoke the same language. So it was not clear ex ante if housing markets would see the Dust Bowl migrants as undesirable. So we can test that, right? So due to the discrimination, we'll test if the real estate markets have priced the houses near the Dust Bowl families as undesirable. So we're going to basically restrict our sample to a sample of incumbent households. So only people that are non-migrant, allow me to say this, these are people that, the Los Angeles population before the shock, right? The non-migrants, we're also obviously excluding the Dust Bowlers within the same neighborhood. We're going to calculate a measure of proximity of your house, if you're one of those people that was there already in Los Angeles before the shock. We're going to calculate a proximity, as kind of the average to the houses occupied by Dust Bowl families. And we're going to control for all the things that you already saw. And that's pretty much what we see. So houses located closer to Dust Bowl migrants had an even lower growth rate in their home value over the decade. So it does seem to have some evidence of discrimination. And now what you see here is interesting. Rents don't display that. At first we thought, okay, rent, why is that? Why is not the case? Well, if you feel, no, I don't want to be here, this is undesirable, there was this mass migration in my own neighborhood. If you're just a renter, you have much more mobility, right? So if you have greater mobility, you're less tied to the properties. Therefore, pricing here is a lot less stringent, the pricing effect. So you basically migrate. This is a phenomenon known as flight, right, in the housing literature. And, just to finalize here, I'm getting close to the end, were these effects large enough to impact entire neighborhoods? We kind of aggregate a little bit. It was nice to have house-level evidence, but it was, you lose too much variation when you do that. So we relax a little bit the assumptions here, and we study neighborhood-level outcomes. So we just run similar regressions for neighborhood-level. When we say neighborhood here, again, it's just grid-level regressions. And we're going to be able to also look at the long-run effects by looking at the census tract level data from ACS using values and rents in 2019. So we see that the effects, they had lower growth rate also at the neighborhood level, but they kind of disappear after, in the longer run. So if you're very negative about mass migration, let's say you're very negative about it, I can see all kinds of problems with it. It doesn't seem that will be a permanent effect, right? It shows up to be the case in the exact decade, and not even a decade, that's a half decade, because the migration actually happened in 1935, most of it. So in 1940, you still see an effect of it, but in the longer run, when you look at 50 years, 60 years later, it's gone. It's undistinguishable. So obviously not going to have time here, so I'm just going to conclude. So we use the Dust Bowls as an historical event that happened already, huge scale event for something that we're going to see nowadays. And we basically need to think about, how do we address these social perceptions and these housing market disruptions in the challenges that we face in our time, right? Because climate migration will still be coming over the next decades. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo, for a very interesting presentation. Let's take a couple of questions. I would say state your questions as a group, and then we'll turn to Gustavo to answer. All right.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. This is Manaswini. I'm from the University of Delaware. I had two questions. So one is, I'm using granularity of data, but within a neighborhood, for example, downtown LA or like East LA, was there any mechanism in assigning these migrants, or were these, they voluntarily, bought a house within a neighborhood? And the second question is with regard to the difference between short-run and long-run effects on the housing value. And I'm not sure if I caught how you're getting the housing value data or the rental data. It could be because in the short run, since these guys have just settled in, they're not in the market, and so that may be artificially lowering the value. So that's it.
These are very good points. Oh, I'm sorry, you wanted to group them.
Let's take a couple of questions. Okay. Anyone else? All right.
I think you might need a model for this, but that price effect that you capture is really the sum of both kind of the disamenity discrimination effect and the potentially positive demand effect, right? So in theory, I think you're kind of underestimating discrimination if you think the demand effect is going the other way. But I wonder if there's a way you can try to decompose that without a supply and demand model, but I'm not sure that that's possible.
Sorry. Yeah.
All right. Last question.
Yeah. Do you observe vacancies? I'm wondering whether migrants go to places where you have a lot of vacant units, and that's an indicator of low demand already.
All right. Okay. I have a final question.
Okay.
So, what's the non-obvious part of this research, right? Here, a bunch of people who get a negative shock, who got low human capital characteristics, move to a new place. Guess what? They're going to sort into really shitty neighborhoods, right? So those places are going to have low housing values. They're going to have low amenities. So that's the market at work. I mean, how do you make a case for discrimination? This was the whole deal that Bullard and others talked about dumping in Dixie, right? Oh, African Americans are being discriminated against because of all these toxic release sites that they live next to. But guess what? Land markets are pretty shitty near interstate highways, and that's where they locate. So I'm trying to see if you're just making a big deal of something that's like to be expected because I have low human capital, low savings, I go to bad neighborhoods. So how do you distinguish discrimination versus just the market at work? And second, over time what you're seeing is that when people gather these skills and human capital, they're just moving to other places, and these places that were doing poorly actually get new people and they start improving. How do you separate those effects?
That's a very good point. This is exactly where we're going with the paper. I mean, to be honest with you, when I ran that regression, I was not expecting to find anything. Because, for the reasons, maybe because of the bias I have working with the Mexican immigration earlier in my career, I kind of thought, look, these are white Americans coming from the center of the country. They share the same heritage. They share the same language. They share everything. They just come from rural areas versus urban areas. That's the only difference they have. They have the same culture and everything. But turned out to be quite surprising. And I agree with you. We cannot say we have a smoking gun. It's discrimination. This is pretty much where we're going right now. We're thinking about some different measures. We're looking at local newspapers database from Melissa Dell at Harvard to see if we were able to find some more granular evidence of discrimination in different areas of LA. That will make it a little bit difficult because for in one hand, you have the advantages of working with just one city, but on the other hand, you also have, whenever you need some more variation like that in slow-moving variables like discrimination, it would be great to have cross-sectional variation to say, look, in some cities, people never talked about, the immigrants. In other cities, the newspapers mention immigrants all the time. And so I think we would, at some point, to make it a more compelling case, we wouldn't have to have that kind of cross-sectional variation, but we're still not there. So I totally take your point. It's a very fair point. I'll try to remember every question, but please let me know if I didn't answer your point. So let me go to Jonah's point that we probably need a model to separate that. I agree with you. Also in the same vein as my earlier answer, it's kind of a lower bound, right? And we would probably need some more granularity to tease out the effects. Not sure if we're going to write a model, but we're also thinking about other ways that we can tease out these effects. These are pretty new results. We just got them this week. So it's very nice to get all the reactions on, what could be the possible, flaws and things that people, get more, curious about. But yeah, this is a good point. There's also a question about vacancies. Unfortunately, we don't observe vacancies. We're working on getting more, merging these data with the recent CarLogic data to see if we're able to observe a little more characteristics of the houses that we see in our historical sample, but that wouldn't be, unfortunately, we wouldn't be able to observe, because the way the census is constructed is basically, well, they put somebody in that quarter, and they go house by house, knocking on the door and say, "What's your name? How many people live here?" And they go asking the question. So if the house is vacant, no, that observation will not show up, unfortunately. And I think there's another question. I'm sorry, my memory is failing me right now. I think it was, yes, thank you so much. If you could just repeat that.
No, I mean, I was just asking, within a neighborhood, how were these migrants allocated to specific houses? Was there any mechanism behind it, or was it all like...
Oh, excellent question. So the only thing that the history of the Dust Bowl migration to LA tells me that is some kind of organization in this process, they set up some camps. So you could call these like refugee camps today. They basically set up camps outside of LA, which were kind of, the first point of to receive those families until they could, get, on their feet and find a job or find a place for their families. So that would be one level. We're thinking about how we could use that as an instrument or something, but we haven't yet explored that possibility yet. But I think that, to your question, is there any kind of organization in this process, some endogenous reason why they ended up locating in those neighborhoods? That would be the closest to it.
Great. I think we're going to move to the next paper now for the sake of time. Thank you very much. All right, coming up next, we have estimating the economic value of zoning reform. And Jonah Rexer works at the World Bank. He's at the South Asia Chief Economist Office. He has a PhD in applied economics from the Wharton School and an MPA from the Kennedy School. Jonah, you're going to tell us about São Paulo, and you'll have about 20 minutes. What's really amazing about this session, I know a little bit about each of the cities that's been discussed. So I got this really bad thing. I know about a city because I live there, or I know about transit because I ride the train. So I've got that superficial knowledge. So Jonah, over to you.
Great, thank you. And thanks so much to the organizers for inviting me today. This is joint work with Santosh Anagal and Fernando Ferreira at Wharton called Estimating the Economic Value of Zoning Reform. And Amrita did a really nice job of kind of motivating the importance of zoning already, but let me add a few things. We know that the world urban population is growing rapidly, and it's going to reach about 70% of the global population by 2050, right? And a major constraint to housing all of these new urbanites is zoning regulation, right? The so-called kind of not in my backyard or NIMBY political orientation. And this has major implications for housing markets, right? Obviously, the quantity of housing and therefore the price. There's really nice work by Ed Glazer, Joe Jerko, and others on that topic. There are segregation effects, right? Residential segregation effects, and zoning may prevent economic convergence across regions. And there's also potentially kind of aggregate, output losses that stem from the fact that, people can't move to the most productive cities because there are zoning barriers and housing restrictions. But it's not an easy topic to study for several reasons. The first is, as Amrita also pointed out, that zoning policy is highly endogenous, right? It could be that kind of higher value, high price areas are able to kind of impose density restrictions on their neighborhoods. And so as a result, there's kind of limited empirical evidence on this topic, although we're seeing kind of a growing literature here. And in particular on kind of how developers at the micro level respond to housing policy reforms. Most of what we see is kind of cross-city studies that use cross-sectional variation. And that, can't fundamentally control for a lot of these sources of endogeneity. And at the same time, it's also quite difficult to measure the equilibrium effects of housing policy in a reduced form design, right? There are all types of different costs and benefits to increasing density. There's, newer buildings, lower prices, potentially access to better paying jobs, but there's also costs like congestion, maybe demographic changes that incumbent residents don't like, and there are wealth transfers from, incumbents to new buyers, right? So these are kind of difficult things to account for if you don't have a kind of systematic model of the housing market. And so that's what this paper is going to do. We're going to study housing market reform in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And what we're going to observe in this context is really detailed changes in the density restrictions in the city at the block level. And we're going to focus on the residential housing market. What we're going to do is similar to Amrita. We're going to use a regression discontinuity design of zoning boundaries to estimate developers' supply responses. And this is going to fundamentally allow us to deal with that endogeneity of zoning policy to prices and neighborhood characteristics. And then lastly, we're going to solve this kind of accounting problem by estimating an equilibrium model of housing supply and demand that allows us to account for a lot of these different costs and benefits of densification. And we're going to simulate in our counterfactuals several different zoning reforms to estimate the welfare effects on house prices, the built environment, and household sorting in Sao Paulo. So let me tell you a little bit about the reform that we're studying here. In 2016, Sao Paulo issued a major change in the legal framework, which unified what's called the built area ratio throughout the city. And previously, in 2004, which is kind of the status quo, the law had this bar parameter being chosen by local neighborhoods, by subregions. So what is bar? It's kind of the same concept as the floor to area ratio. It's basically just the sum of the total the total floor space, livable floor space over the lot area. So that picture on the right, right? So in this case, we have kind of 5 floors. We add up the total floor space of those floors and it's divided by the lot area. So this is fundamentally kind of the binding constraint on densification. If you increase bar, you can increase how high you build and the amount of floor space you can put on a given lot. In Sao Paulo, there's like a little bit of a wrinkle in that we look at computable built area, which is kind of just a technical term for living space that doesn't include kind of common areas, amenities, hallways, things like that. The reform had kind of 3 distinct goals that were kind of imposed on different parts of the city. The first were the so-called transformation zones, which is areas where they wanted to upzone or allow more density. Those were mostly around kind of big avenues, transportation corridors. The second were the so-called qualification zones, which are kind of like small changes in zoning, either negative or positive, for basically established residential neighborhoods. And then lastly, we had the preservation zones. Think of this as kind of like the historical center of the city, or some outlying areas that are more kind of green spaces. And those are where they actually restricted density more. And so what happened ultimately in the reform is that the maximum allowable built area ratio increased in over half of the city blocks, and in 45% of those blocks, the increase was of 1 unit or more. And so just to give you a sense of magnitudes here, on average, the increase was pre-reform bar was about 1.5. It increased to about 2.1, 36%. So not a huge not a huge change on average. Just to give you some context, in a kind of super dense city like Hong Kong, that number can go up to like 10. So we're talking about a pretty low density situation. There's still a lot more that could be done in this type of context. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when interpreting the results. Just to give you kind of a flavor for what this looks like, and what kind of our strategy is leveraging. These are two different zoning neighborhoods that are right next to each other. In Sao Paulo, you have like on one side of the road these kind of giant residential towers. On the other side, basically single-family homes. And so that's essentially what this reform was doing. It was kind of delineating which areas could have the towers and which areas couldn't, essentially. And so what we're going to do is use that variation at the really kind of micro level in this regression discontinuity design. First, we're going to essentially, for each block in the city, from roughly 45,000 blocks, we're going to say, if your max bar increased as a result of the reform, you're treated. If it stayed the same or decreased, you're a control block. And this map is basically just going to show you the geographic distribution of those treatment and controls. As you can see, in the center of the city is where there's the most purple, where there's kind of the most reduction in density. That's basically the historical center. And so that's kind of a preservation zone. But you can see like all these corridors of dark green, those are basically like main avenues and kind of large transportation corridors, which were your transformation zones. And what we're going to define as our running variable in the regression discontinuity is the distance between a treated block and the nearest control block, basically the point at which the zoning switches from up zoning to down zoning. So kind of the boundary between one of those purple areas and its nearest neighboring green area, and that's going to be where we look at the kind of jump in allowable density. The data that we're going to use is to measure our outcomes, which are developer supply responses. We're going to look at the universe of new building permits that are applied for and issued by the city. We're going to have really rich housing characteristics from 3 million municipal property tax records across the city. That's also the universe of property tax records. And so that gives us a long panel of kind of levels of density and overall kind of neighborhood characteristics over time. And then, of course, we're going to have our treatment variable, which is essentially this map, which is it's two maps, actually. It's the 2004 and 2016 block by block zoning maps, which indicate the maximum allowable density. So what does the kind of jump look like? So this is right at the boundary of the regression discontinuity. There's a huge change in the maximum allowable density. As I mentioned, prior to the reform, the max bar was about 1.5. At this boundary, it's about 1.3, and then it jumps by about 1.3 units to 2.6. So this plots the change on the left-hand side, and so that 1.3, 1.35 unit increase is basically the variation that we're going to leverage at this boundary. And so what happens to outcomes on the left? So here we're looking at multifamily building permits. And on the left-hand side, we're looking at the difference in these two groups before the reform, in the periods right before 2016. These are average quarterly block level permits that are filed for multifamily development. And as you can see, there's a little difference, but it's not substantial in the pre-reform. So these are not perfectly balanced, but you can see that gap really opens up after the reform commences. We have some kind of time series results as well that show that this thing gets bigger and bigger over time after 2016. In terms of kind of magnitudes, it looks very small, 0.003 more permits per block per quarter. But as you might guess, in most blocks, in most quarters, there are no permits filed at all, right? So kind of scaling this, it's about a 67% increase in filed permits, multifamily permits, for that 1.3 unit increase in maximum allowable built area ratio. And an interesting kind of falsification test that we can do is we can look at single-family developments, which are ultimately not going to really be bound by this bar restriction because they're just 1 or 2 stories, and we find no evidence that those change at all at this boundary. So clearly, this is binding for large developments, for multifamily developments, and not for smaller developments. So it is the reform, it is the density restriction that's actually generating this increase. Now, what about kind of equilibrium outcomes, quantities and prices? For this analysis, we're not using our regression discontinuity because, as I mentioned, these are kind of equilibrium outcomes that might change on either side of the boundary, particularly prices, right? Because those are kind of set across neighborhoods in equilibrium. So what we do is we aggregate to 329 commuting zones. We look at listings and prices from kind of the Zillow of Brazil, basically, and then we plot those, the change in listings and change in prices against the kind of average neighborhood level change in max bar, and we find pretty strong correlations on both of those. A 1 unit max bar increase is correlated with an 11% increase in listings and a 6% reduction in prices. But again, these are equilibrium objects, and even if you aggregate up to neighborhood levels, there's still substitution across neighborhoods as well. So ultimately, what we need to kind of get reliable price and quantity estimates is a model, right? And so what we're going to do here is we're going to build a model of the housing market to estimate the welfare consequences of this reform, and also do simulations potentially of other possible housing market reforms. So there's going to be 2 components to the model, as there often is. There's the demand side, which is households choosing neighborhoods based on the prices of housing in those neighborhoods, as well as the housing amenities that they can enjoy in those neighborhoods. This is a model adopted from Fernando's work with Pat Baer in 2007, JPE paper. It's basically a random coefficients multinomial logit model. So for the kind of IO people in here, that's basically a BLP for a neighborhood choice. And we estimated in 2 stages, what's called this micro BLP. First, maximum likelihood to estimate the kind of heterogeneity, and then IV for the average coefficients. And we have some IVs for price. I don't want to get into too much detail there. And then on the supply side, it's a bit simpler. We're basically just running a regression of permits on prices and zoning with instruments for those variables. We're modeling it as a Poisson regression because this is kind of a count outcome. We're using GMM to estimate it, and we're including IVs for both prices and for zoning policies. So for the prices, we're using essentially a labor demand shock that would bid up labor demand and consequently housing demand in particular neighborhoods. Is basically a shift share. And then for zoning, we're going to use our regression discontinuity. So we're embedding this kind of quasi-experimental variation in the model to identify the structural parameters of the model and allow us to do simulations based on kind of clean variation. So let me give you a sense of the demand estimates, or what's in the demand model. First of all, so we have, of course, prices. The bottom line, which I'm drawing your attention to here, is what's called the base coefficients without any household heterogeneity. So these are kind of the average preference parameters for these neighborhood attributes. Of course, households have a negative price elasticity. They also dislike travel time, so that's kind of a commuting cost variable. They like what's called RCMA, which is residential commuter market access. That's a measure of kind of the weighted average of wages in your neighborhood. So it's kind of a measure of whether you're near good-paying jobs. That's from Nick Sivanides' work, recent work. So they like being near good-paying jobs, understandably. They dislike older housing, so they like newer stock of housing. Units is the average number of units per building. So they don't like tall towers necessarily, but households do like more aggregate density. So that's just the total constructed area for the total land area of the neighborhood. So they like walkability, but not necessarily kind of huge apartment towers. And then we look at, there's some preference for better infrastructure, paved roads, and local demographics. And then we look at, again, like several characteristics of household heterogeneity. So these preference parameters differ by household characteristics, household size, the age of the household head, whether it's a renting or owning household, income and education. And we do find kind of pretty rich patterns of heterogeneity. Different types of consumers prefer different housing attributes, which is going to generate, kind of like really complicated and rich sorting patterns about which neighborhoods people like to choose. Now, on the supply side, I want to basically just draw your attention to the 5th column here, where we're, this is our Poisson regression, where we regress multifamily housing permits on the maximum available bar, the price, and then other neighborhood characteristics. And we have those our IVs, the regression discontinuity, and the shift share IV for price. And these are kind of our supply elasticity coefficients. just to kind of give you the interpretation, because this is an exponential model, so the coefficients are not obviously easily interpretable. A 1 unit increase in max bar increases the neighborhood level annual permits by 5 multifamily permits, and 1,000 reals increase in price per square meter. This is all normalized. Increases. That's about a 20% increase in average prices. Increases permits by 2.5 roughly per neighborhood per year. So we're still not talking about huge amounts of permit activity. So then, of course, equilibrium condition is supply equals demand for each neighborhood, about 350 neighborhoods in the city. So these are neighborhoods with about 10,000 residents. And then once we impose our equilibrium condition, we can run simulations for different zoning policies. And how does that work? We essentially impose a zoning map M, so we kind of shock the model with a particular zoning map, because we know, based on our parameters, how developers will respond to any given zoning map. And then we search for the price vector that equates supply and demand, basically solving the system of nonlinear equations given a zoning map M. And then once we have our M and our P, we calculate the new neighborhood characteristics. Where are people going to move to at that price and that zoning map? And that's going to change the age of units, right? Because more units will be built in certain areas. It'll change the average number of units per building. It will change the overall density of neighborhoods. It will change travel time, because there's a kind of a congestion cost that we include in the model when population increases in a given location. And it will, of course, also potentially change demographics based on the sorting patterns on the demand side, all right? And so a lot of things might change, which affect consumer welfare in this context. So then we run counterfactuals, which are basically kind of over a 10-year horizon. What's going to happen to all of these outcomes? Good. When we impose different zoning maps. Of course, our kind of status quo is the 2004 zoning map. Then we impose the observed zoning map from 2016, and then we also impose a kind of like more aggressive scenario that we call double bar, which is if you doubled bar in all of the places that were upzoned in 2016, and then set the change to equal to 0 in the places that were either downzoned, basically in the control area. So that's kind of doubling the 2016 zoning reform, and that has much larger effects as you might expect. And so what do we get out of this model? So this table kind of summarizes the equilibrium effects. As you can see, these are kind of the bar changes in the various scenarios, which I've already mentioned. The reform was actually a pretty small shock. I think that's the most important thing to take away. It increased, to aggregate supply by about 47,000 units, which is only 2% of the total stock, right? So the city's not growing that much with this 2016 reform, based on the kind of elasticities that we estimate, and that leads to about a 0.5% per square foot reduction in prices. So, these are not huge effects because the shock is actually not very large. As you might expect, the effect is much larger with double bar because there's a much larger housing supply response, about a 40% increase. But that kind of stretches a bit the credibility of some of the assumptions that we're making here, particularly around dynamics. And so, that's more speculative kind of scenario. What happens in the model, of course, places that had higher kind of changes in bar see lower prices and more units. And there's a lot of heterogeneity here, because there's a lot of heterogeneity in where households move and where new housing gets built. And so the largest increases in bar are associated with a 14% increase in construction and a 5.6% reduction in price. So at the high end, you can see fairly large effects, but on average, the effects are just not that large because the total aggregate shock is not that large. Now, what about surplus? Again, because the shock is not that large, the kind of consumer welfare gains are quite small. This table gives us, basically the consumer welfare gains after updating prices, which is P, X, which is kind of the neighborhood amenities, and tau, which is travel time. And I think what's interesting with this table really shows is that the consumer welfare gains increase fourfold once you update neighborhood amenities. Really, a lot of the welfare gains are not coming through price, but rather coming through changes in the built environment that people value, like newer housing stock and increased density. Right? People like those things. And as you can see, the change in travel time only reduces welfare in a very small way. There's some kind of heterogeneity in who gains the most, but I'm going to skip that because I'm running out of time, because I do want to get to this slide. Essentially, this slide is going to kind of value those consumer welfare gains against other potential effects of the reform. So developer profits, because developers are making profits from the new housing. That's a surplus, right? And then productivity gains, which we get from Glazer and Zhou. We do kind of a back of the envelope about how this is allowing wages to equalize across locations, because more people can move to Sao Paulo, the most productive metro in the country. And so in total, when you add those up, it's less than 1% of GDP in terms of gains. That's quite small. And when you compare it to kind of the transfers from homeowners to kind of new buyers, that's about 2% of GDP. So basically the kind of losses that incumbents are facing in terms of wealth is much greater than the overall kind of surplus effects. These aren't losses in real sense, they're just transfers. But ultimately it suggests that those people can block reform because they're kind of losing more than society is gaining. This is not necessarily kind of like a Pareto optimal zoning reform. So let me stop there. I'm a little bit over time, but I look forward to your thoughts and questions.
That's a great presentation. Thank you very much. Colleagues, also, I think the way you ended it is incumbents losing out, and they will be the biggest constituency against reform. I think that's a really good point and things that we don't really explore enough. So very well done for bringing that out. A couple of questions, and then we'll come to a final presenter. All right.
Okay. So it was a pity you didn't have time to cover who gains the most, because I think, when I see the discussions in Brazil, especially I'm from São Paulo, so I know exactly like what people are talking about right now, where we're having mayoral elections at the end of the year. And, what they say is like, you want to see the lower distribution of the income distribution, the poorer people, having a chance to live in the high-paid job areas, because they basically waste 2 hours of their time, 3 hours of their time on each leg of the trip. And I think, if you could just give us a bit more insights on who gains, especially from that perspective, if the poorer parts of the São Paulo population would be contributing to that welfare gain, even though it's like in aggregate it's small. If you think, these are the ones we should care about anyways.
Totally.
So let's take a couple of questions, all right?
Yeah, I think quite related to that. So first of all, I love the paper. I was also wondering about spatial inequality because of how the reform was introduced, where there were some areas that were preserved and essentially areas that seemed like they were already denser potentially before were gaining even more density. So I was wondering if you ever calculated kind of a spatial Gini, or if you could tell us, I think along the same lines, what happens to spatial inequality, like where do people resort? And do we now see more lower income individuals in kind of the same neighborhood than maybe even before the reform?
Great. Any questions from that side of the room? All right.
I'll help you out here. I am sort of interested in sort of the intergovernmental policy implications here, because both Amrita and you talked about these being local initiatives to change zoning regulations. And I'm interested in that because, there are incumbents losing out, and these are people who get elected, and there's a danger that they won't be reelected. We're seeing a lot of things here in the US and also in Canada, where I'm from, where the federal government is saying, we'll give you housing money if you change your zoning regulations, which I find a bit peculiar that the federal government knows anything about zoning. But were these motivated by state or federal legislation to actually change these regulations? How did that come about?
All right. I'll turn it over to you. Gustavo, just on your point, the big problem in Latin American cities is the lack of employment deconcentration. If you look at LA, where you study, in your case, there are about 42 different employment sub-centers. And if you look at Sao Paulo, any of these, there are only a handful. So there's another coordination problem. It's not only sorting of people into better neighborhoods, is a lack of decentralization of jobs of all types into different areas. So, but just as a point, but over to you. All right.
Thank you. That's a great point. And that's something that we definitely saw in the data as well when we looked at the distribution of residential commuter market access. It's very concentrated. Okay, so who gains the most? Interestingly, we find that kind of perhaps consistent with some of the skeptics, it's not the poor that are gaining the most. We find that more educated and richer households tend to resort more into the new housing. In the kind of within the internal framework of the model, it's because they have more responsive preferences for the newer housing and for actually the cheaper housing. I think that's basically capturing that they have more mobility, right? And so what we actually see, interestingly, is this dynamic where the reform is pulling people from outside of the city into the city, so it's creating more opportunity within the city. And most of the people that it's pulling out from kind of the nearby suburbs are the more educated and the wealthier people who are then kind of coming and filling neighborhoods that are similar to them. Because another part of this is that there's a fair amount of homophily in people's preferences for living around people like them. So if the reform increased density more in poorer neighborhoods, we might see more poor people entering the city and living in those kind of lower rent neighborhoods. But that's not actually what we see. And so in terms of spatial inequality, what this does, it actually has an interesting effect where, on average, the suburbs in Brazil are actually poorer than the city. And what this does is it kind of like skims the cream off the top of the suburbs and pulls those people into the city. So it doesn't actually change the demographics of the city very much, but it kind of leaves more poor people and less educated people in the suburbs. So it increases spatial inequality between like the kind of just outside the kind of inner ring suburbs and the city itself. So when we look at demographics, we find very little change in demographics in the city, but pretty big changes in the suburbs. Some of this is just kind of like the way the model works, but I think that there is something there as well about increasing spatial inequality, and yeah, we find kind of bigger bigger welfare gains for essentially richer households because they have more mobility and can take advantage of essentially the new housing that's built. In terms of the kind of the political economy of this reform, that's a good question, and something that I'd like to do some follow-up work on at some point. I think the motivation here was actually kind of like a leftist motivation. It was a local initiative. It wasn't something that was necessarily like a federal policy. It was a city-level initiative, but at the same time, it was a centralizing initiative because it was taking away neighborhood control from local sub-city jurisdictions who previously had the power to kind of set zoning policy and centralizing it at the city level, because the argument was that the rich neighborhoods are setting exclusionary zoning policies. We need to take that power away from them, essentially. So it did do that to some extent, but we haven't investigated enough the correlates of zoning reform. One thing we did find, though, which is in the appendix of the paper, is that richer areas were still able to kind of carve themselves out, and you see bigger upzoning in kind of moderate income areas, and in the richest neighborhoods, you don't see much upzoning at all. So there's some interesting stuff there that we should explore in more detail. But yeah, the political economy of it is an important angle for sure.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
One thing, as you guys improve the paper, I think a lot of you talked about spatial inequality in the static sense. But you can have high spatial inequality and high mobility, right? And that can be okay. And I think we just look at this one cross-section saying, oh, this is really bad. All right. The last paper, and I'd like to welcome Zhou from the University of Maryland, who's going to present his paper on Shanghai, Under Control, Price Ceiling, Queuing, and Misallocation, Evidence from the Housing Market in China, though I believe the data is from Shanghai, right? So,
a city close to Shanghai.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Close. Right. Well, you have 20 minutes. We're very excited. And everyone, please, ask encouraging questions as you get ready to defend your dissertation, right? So.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I will talk about my job market paper on the control price ceiling, queuing, and misallocation evidence from the housing market in China. So price control is a widely used regulatory tool in the housing, energy, and the healthcare market worldwide. And examples of the price control including the rent control in many big cities like New York City, Stockholm, and San Francisco. Most of the existing literature that uses a static approach to analyze the effect of the price control. And they mainly focus on the two dimensions of the welfare loss associated with the price control. The first one is the undersupply of the good, and the second one is the misallocation. In this setting, misallocation refers to things, the seller or the central planner cannot distinguish the buyers based on their willingness to pay, since price ceiling generates the excess demand, and they use some random allocation mechanisms to assign the goods to the buyer, and yeah. So, however, as far as I'm concerned, there are very important dimensions that is often ignored in the empirical works that study the price control, which is the waiting cost. So you can basically imagine a scenario that in the market with excess demand, buyers who cannot get what they want in the current time period, they will choose to wait and to re-enter in the future. So one example of the salient waiting cost in the price control setting is, the average waiting time in order to get into a rent-controlled apartment in Stockholm is 10 years. So this is actually a screenshot taken from BBC News. It basically says that in some neighborhoods in Stockholm, the waiting time can be as long as 20 years. So basically, in order to get into a house, rent-controlled apartment, you need to join the line when you are born. Yeah. So in this paper, I mainly focus on the three main research questions. So first one, how to model waiting when households face a price ceiling, and how to quantify the welfare loss associated with the price ceiling. And finally, how does the price ceiling policy compare with alternative policies that can achieve similar price reduction outcomes in improving the housing affordability? So in this paper, I focus on the housing market in Shanghai, where the new house price are capped and the existing house prices are largely markedly driven. And since the price cap in the new house market generates the excess demand, and the government uses a lottery to allocate the new houses. And similar types of policy has been implemented in almost all large cities in China. And it is also worthwhile to note that the real estate sector accounts for a large part of the national economy. So I specify and estimate a structural model that incorporates weighting, and using this model, I conduct several counterfactual exercises. I examine the welfare loss associated with the price cap. I also examine other counterfactual policies like distributing housing vouchers and increase the new house supply. So what I find is that the waiting cost actually plays a very important role in the process of the price ceiling. So the welfare loss from price cap is around $13 billion during my sample periods. Among them, the waiting cost is $5 billion, and the misallocation accounts for $8 billion. The consumer gains are fairly limited. This is because most of part of the consumer gains due to lower prices are offset by waiting and misallocation. I conducted several counterfactual policies. One policy that I would like to mention here is to distribute housing vouchers. I find that housing vouchers can significantly reduce welfare loss. This is because housing vouchers eliminate waiting and significantly reduces misallocation. Since price in the housing voucher scenario are very effective in selecting the consumers based on their willingness to pay. And more interestingly, distributing housing vouchers can result in more equitable outcomes if the housing voucher policy can be designed in a subtle way, and I will discuss this later. A brief overview of the literature. So this paper connects to the empirical literature that study the impact of the price ceiling or the rent control in the housing market. There are actually a lot of papers that focus on different perspectives of different effects of the price control. And it is also to mention that all these papers use a reduced form approach and do not take into account weighting seriously. So I think the main contribution of this paper is that I incorporate weighting into the analysis of the price ceiling. So Glaser actually, in his 1996 working paper, models weighting in a theoretical framework. However, most empirical works have not considered weighting seriously, and I provide a tractable framework that enables us to model price ceiling with weighting, and I use a structural approach to quantify the welfare effects of the weighting based on my the welfare effects of the price ceiling based on my model. As I just mentioned, most existing literature use a reduced form approach. Using a structural approach can help us to better understand the welfare consequences, and it can also guide better counterfactual policy experiments. This paper also relates to the literature that studies the housing market regulation in China and also the design of the allocation mechanisms. So let me just briefly talk about the background of the price cap of the price ceiling in Shanghai. So houses are increasingly unaffordable in large cities in China, not just in China but across the world. So like basically in Shanghai, a 90 square meter houses cost around 25 years of a median household's annual salary, which is unaffordable. And in order to improve the housing affordability, the government in Shanghai has imposed a price cap on new houses in July 2017. The existing houses are not subject to this kind of price ceiling. And the price ceiling generates the excess demand. The government uses a lottery to allocate the new houses for each project. And households typically need to participate into multiple lotteries in order to get into a house. And this introduces the cost of waiting, and different new apartment complexes subject to different price caps. The waiting costs in my setting are prominent since it not only incorporates the time cost of waiting, but it also incorporates some financial cost of participating into the lottery. So basically, you need to deposit around 30% of the housing price a month before in order to participate into the lottery, to signal that you are a serious bidder. And there are also like some additional costs like renting or like the psychological cost of anxiety of waiting. So this map shows us the spatial distribution of the price ceiling in Shanghai. So each dot represents a new apartment complex, and the dot with the darker color represents the houses that has very low winning probability, or like the lottery is very competitive. So actually, there are two main takeaways from this figure. So first of all, we can find that most of the new apartment complex that face price ceiling are located in downtown areas in Shanghai. And secondly, even in very small geographical regions, we can find sizable variations in terms of the price ceiling extent. So this gives us like variations in the empirical estimation. So like the model is so let me talk about the model. So like so let's first focus on the demand side. Imagine that you're a household in the housing market in Shanghai, and you have three choices in your choice set. You can choose to buy a new house, J. You can also choose to buy an existing house, J prime. You can choose to wait. And household I's indirect utility function of successfully purchasing house J can be written like in very standard form. Household I can get positive utility from XJ. They may get negative utility from a higher price. Psi J captures like the unobserved like heterogeneity, and epsilon ij follows from I, the extreme type 1 value distribution. And household I faces trade-offs between the new houses and the existing ones. Let me just like use CI to represent the household I's per period waiting cost. So choosing the new house J means that household I may have some probability of winning the lottery, and winning the lottery means that household I may get the utility, may enjoy the utility of a lower price due to government's price regulations PJ bar, right? And if the household I, however, household I also has some probability of losing the lottery. Losing the lottery means that household I needs to pay the waiting cost and enter into the next time period. Choosing the existing house J prime, in contrast, does not require waiting. Household I can get the house immediately, but they may not enjoy the utility from a lower price due to government's price regulations. So basically, household I's value function can be written as follows. Household I is choosing like the option that could give her the highest valuation from the new house, existing house, or choose simply to wait, or like the outside option, which is not to buy anything. And if we use PRJT represents household I's lottery winning probability, and finally we can after some algebra we can write household I's valuation of purchasing new house J in the following form. So basically UIJT, this term represents household I's utility of getting the house successfully, and the second term represents the waiting cost. And the final term represents a kind of like the future impact if we consider this model in a dynamic setting. We can further simplify this model by imposing a stability assumption. So basically the stability assumption says that households expected valuation of being in the poor tomorrow is the same as being in the poor today. And after this kind of simplification, we can write down household I's indirect utility function for both new and existing house in the following form, where the first term represents the household I's utility function of getting the house successfully, and the last term represents the weighting cost. And this kind of like weighting cost has very nice reduced form interpretations. You can just imagine that when you choose like a new apartment complex with lottery winning probability, let's say 10%, and suppose that this new apartment complex is also, or the new apartment complex with similar quality is also available in the market in the future, and you are expected to participate into 10 lotteries in order to win it, right? And so the expected waiting time is kind of like 9 times like the per period waiting cost CI. And then after this kind of simplification, demand can be estimated using like fairly standard BRP algorithm. And I also estimate models that more flexible demand models, since this is a Zhou market paper, so like I need to add some like dynamics in that. And but like in my presentation, I would just like skip this part. So the supply side is as follows. So like in the new house supply, I assume that the supply of the new houses is predetermined. So this is because the average construction time is around 3 to 4 years, and I focus on kind of like short or medium term impact. And my sample period is 2018 to 2020. So for most of the new apartment complex that was sold during my sample periods, their construction plan was made before that. And the long-term new house supply also tends to be inelastic. This is because the land is owned by the state, and the land supply is completely regulated by like the government. And in terms of the existing house supply, it is endogenous. The supply of existing house is modeled as a binary choice problem. So basically, you can imagine that like facing you are the house seller, you are the current resident, and you take the price as given and decide whether to sell the house or not. And so the equilibrium is determined by the two variables. Since in the new house market, it is not the price that clears the market. It is the lottery winning probability, since the price is determined by the government. And so basically in the new house market, we have the number of lottery participants equals the supply plus the equilibrium queuing line. And in the existing house market, it is still the price that clears the market. We follow like fairly standard market clearing conditions. The existing house demand equals the existing house supply. So the data I use comes from like 3 different sources. So the new house data comes from I manually collected the new house data. I got the information from the official of relating number of lottery participants and the supply of new houses from the official documents and the correct data set. And I also know like the price ceiling set by the government, obviously. And the lottery participation data comes from the Shanghai Rental Public Lottery Office. So so this kind of like office. So from this data, I got like unique ID. So it enables me to match the buyers across time, across like different lotteries. And the existing house data comes from Lenja dataset. Lenja is similar to like Zillow in the States. So it contains around, this data set contains around 25% of all existing house transactions in Shanghai. And I got very detailed information about houses' hedonic characteristics. And so like this map actually shows us like the key like mappings that I would like to show in that paper is that basically I need to find like a mapping between the lottery winning probability and the expected waiting time, right? And so in this figure, the y-axis is the average waiting time from the raw data, and the x-axis is the lottery winning probability for the new apartment complex. And we can find a very clear like negative relationship even from the raw data. I also need to use some instruments in order to give my identification. The instruments the instruments for the price are fairly standard. I mainly follow from the literature, but the new IV here is that we also need an IV for the waiting time or the lottery winning probability, since it is also endogenously determined in the equilibrium. And the IV I use is the supply of the new apartment complex, since in my model, the supply of the new apartment complex is predetermined variable, at least in the short run, and it highly correlates with the lottery winning probability. So let me just show you the estimation results. So like in the demand model, so this table shows us the demand estimation results. So the first 2 columns shows us the model estimation results when I impose the stability assumption, which is estimated using the standard Baerlocher and Pake's algorithm. And we can find that the waiting cost actually plays a very important role in households' choice problem. And the results are fairly similar when I relax the demand the stability assumption used by imposing like more flexible assumption that allows households that allows housing stocks to be dynamics. And I find like the results are fairly similar. In the supply side, I find that the supply of the existing house is also elastic, but less elastic compared with the demand side. And this is in line with the literature's findings. The implied supply elasticity is around 2.7, which is similar to Li and Al's findings in Singapore. Based on the model estimates, I conducted several counterfactual exercises. So the first counterfactual exercise I did is to examine what would happen if there is no price ceiling. So what I find is that the welfare loss associated with the price cap is around 13 billion US, and the price cap reduces on average around 1.6% on price decrease. The weighting cost among them, the weighting cost is $5 billion, and the misallocation is 8. So the misallocation refers to, since the price cap generates the excess demand, and households cannot, and the sellers or the government cannot distinguish the buyers based on their willingness to pay, so they randomly allocate the houses to the households. And the consumer surplus gains are fairly limited, which stands to around $1.3 billion. And this is because consumer gains are offset by weighting and misallocation. Another counterfactual I did is to examine what would happen if the government can distribute the housing vouchers instead of the price ceiling. So conceptually, housing vouchers can significantly increase welfare since it reduces misallocation and eliminates weighting. And if the housing vouchers can be designed in a proper way, they can also achieve similar, more equitable outcomes. So this paper considers two types of vouchers. One is a 4% vouchers to all houses, including both new and existing ones. Good. And another type of voucher is that a 6% vouchers to buyers of the houses that are below 90 square meters. So this table shows us the impact of the housing voucher. So we can find that if the government can distribute like the housing vouchers instead, the welfare loss is like an order of magnitude smaller than the welfare loss associated with price cap. It only stands for around 0.5 to 0.6 billion US dollars, right? And the government can actually, more interestingly, the government can actually finance these vouchers by raising a lump sum tax from the developers. The developers are actually willing to pay this tax as long as their loss from the housing vouchers are smaller than their loss from the price cap. So basically, we can achieve like a kind of like quasi-Pareto improvement. Both the buyers, the developers, and the government are all happy with like distributing housing vouchers. More interestingly, I find that distributing housing vouchers can achieve more equitable outcomes. So like this figure shows us like the distributional impact of the price cap. So the x-axis represents, in the x-axis, I divide the houses into 10 percentiles, equal percentiles based on their total housing price. In the y-axis, it represents the housing price changes faced by the consumers. And we can find that the price ceiling, this figure shows us like the distributional impact of the price ceiling. And we can find that the price ceiling primarily benefit the house buyers of the houses that are in the top quantiles. This is because the new apartment complexes are typically more expensive in the unit price, more likely to locate it in downtown, and bigger in size compared with the existing ones. And however, if the government can distribute a 4% vouchers to all to house buyers of all houses, and we can find that the price reduction effect are fairly flat. And if the government can distribute a 6% housing vouchers instead, we can find that the housing vouchers can primarily benefit the house buyers of the houses that are in the bottom percentiles. So to summarize, in this paper, I studied the welfare impacts of the price ceiling, and I find that weighting costs play a very important role in the effect of evaluating the effects of the price ceiling. And I find that the welfare loss due to the price cap in Shanghai from 2018 to 2020 is huge. It amounts to around $13 billion. Among them, weighting cost is 5, and the misallocation is 8. Housing vouchers, generally speaking, are more efficient and can achieve more equitable outcomes compared with the price cap, since it eliminates weighting and reduces misallocation. And obviously, the framework I would like to highlight that the framework I developed not only applied like to the Shanghai's housing market, but it can also be extended to the other settings. For instance, the rent control, the healthcare market in Canada, where the price cap is also prevalent, and also like kind of like the H1B lottery. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our speakers. Let's have one round of questions on this paper. We have about 5 minutes in the session. Any questions? All right, please.
So I had a question about your weighting cost, which you kind of construe as a welfare loss. But one way you can think about weighting costs as, as another allocation mechanism itself, like price. So how does that interact with your model?
Great question.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, my question is actually about the weighting cost as well. This is a fantastic paper, by the way. Really enjoyed that. You're basically like identifying the weighting costs based on variation in like the size of the developments, effectively, like or how many available units there are, or just can you clarify that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let me first answer your questions, or like maybe we can wait for another one.
No, I think let's go with these two.
Okay. Yeah. Let's first start with your question. So basically, I think the weighting is identified through the variations in terms of the lottery winning probability, right? Since I think the key insight of the paper is to construct a mapping between the lottery winning probability and the expected waiting time. The lower the lottery winning probability is, the longer the expected waiting times that you have. But like the lottery winning probability is endogenous, I need to instrument for like kind of like the number of available units that are available for the lottery.
Right. So it's being identified based on the number of units. Mm-hmm. But isn't that potentially correlated with unobserved like housing quality characteristics? So that's where I would worry. Maybe you're just picking up other housing characteristics that are not in your model, basically.
Yes, that's a very good question. I think to alleviate the concern, I actually control for like very fine level like fixed grid level, very fine level fixed effect. Basically, I control for like the zip code level fixed effect. I also like try to control for like the developer level like the developer level fixed effect in order to control for like kind of like the building quality. And I think this kind of like the number of available units that are for the lottery are kind of like predetermined 3 years ago. Basically, the developers cannot expect there will be kind of like a price ceiling. And they are not legally allowed to change the kind of like the construction plan. And back to the question about like the interaction between the weighting and the pricing. Like the weighting is another kind of like mechanisms to allocate the goods. This is actually a very good question. I think I didn't show my results here, but like in my paper, I have a both theory and like kind of like an empirical exercise to show that like the weighting is kind of like when we have like the kind of positive weighting cost, the misallocation can be reduced. This is kind of like kind of weighting to sorting story, right? Since you can imagine that like when we have like kind of like the weighting cost in the model, and households who have like high willingness to pay will be willing to pay this kind of like weighting cost, and they are more likely to join the waiting line in order to get into the house. And households with low willingness to pay will opt to choose to, for instance, to buy the existing houses that do not require waiting. Right, and I actually show that, like both theoretically and empirically, the weighting when we have the weighting cost, misallocation is reduced, but like the total welfare will increase.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And colleagues, thanks for being here for 2 hours. It's been a great discussion and 4 papers, and I'm sure the authors will be available if you have further questions. Klaus, I think what will be really useful is for us to kind of synthesize some of the key questions, and you should put a blog out or something on that as directions in which allocations of misallocation in land and housing markets really exacerbate welfare. That would be something worth pursuing. So I think over to you, Klaus, as we close the session.
Nothing to add. I think thank you very much. I think these were very excellent papers, I think, and we look forward, or I think there's lunch outside, and we can discuss some of the more detailed questions there. Thank you.